Okay, today we have a distinguished guest speaker and historian, Professor David H. And he received his PhD from University of Wisconsin-Madison, and his work has focused on African and African American history, music, art, literature, and cinema. And his research has focused on the history, particularly of East and South Africa, as well as their geopolitical relation to South Asia, including India. He also looked at the Islamic civilization and African diaspora around the globe. He has done extensive field work in Tanzania, Sritu, in South Africa, and many others, and published 3 books, including much praised book you can see on the desk, Max Yergan, Raceman, Internationalist, Cold Warrior, which was published by New York University Press. This is yet the best book ever, written on the complex, controversial, in some ways, a black political activist. Max Yergan was African-American political activist born in the late 19th century and passed away in 1975, 1 year before his former comrade, Paul Robeson, passed away in 1976. Both of them died in relative isolation despite their prominent international political activism throughout the first half of the 20th century. Both were communist members and helped co-found the International Committee on African Affairs in 1937, which later became the Council on African Affairs. Yergan also served as a YMCA secretary for the Union of South Africa from 1922 to 1936. Unlike Paul Robeson, who soon started working with African American activists such as W.E.B. Du Bois and William Patterson, who was a UC Berkeley and UC Hastings graduate, who became a strong supporter of Black Panther Party, including Angela Davis, who was a communist and a Black Panther tried for murder in the early 1970s. Max Yergan, who was a Baptist missionary, went to India, South Africa, and many East and South region of Africa to help build YMCA, and soon became increasingly disillusioned of communism and became anti-communist political activist later in his life. Like many Black Panther Party members, FBI had long surveilled, monitored Max Yergan throughout his life. So in his book, Professor David H. went through original documents of Max Yergan, so that the initial draft of the book manuscript went beyond 900 pages. Professor David H. may talk about his life in relation to Pan-African activism. Here at the UC Santa Cruz, Professor David H. has received many awards recognizing his excellence in research, teaching, and mentorship, including UCSC Chancellor's Achievement Award for Diversity, as well as the Excellence in Teaching Award. He also served as a provost of Oaks College, where we are now at this point, which J. Herman Blake, first black sociologist here at the UC Santa Cruz, co-founded in 1968. Professor Herman Blake co-wrote the book Revolutionary Suicide with Huey P. Newton, the co-founder of the Black Panther Party, who went on to earn his bachelor's as well as PhD in History of Consciousness at UC Santa Cruz. Please welcome Professor David H.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Fukurai. And thank you all for showing up today. Fall is in full effect. It's foggy, it's cool. The fog will break later on today, but I'm respecting the weather. I think I should start off by telling a little bit of how I got involved in the story of Max Yergan. And it actually goes back to my beginning of my graduate study at the University of Wisconsin, I was always interested in the relationship between people of African descent and the African continent. It's something that developed really when I was a kid, because I had a fairly unusual family. My mother was a secretary for a variety of different companies, but for a particular period of her life, she worked in very close proximity to the United Nations. I grew up in New York City. And in the time that she was working, which was the late 50s and early 60s, a lot of formerly colonized nations were becoming independent. And so people dignitaries would be moving in and out of the UN. And the UN is a really interesting place because you can, as a bystander, just kind of walk into the UN, and sometimes you can walk into deliberations of the Security Council, this, that, and it's a very democratic and very approachable organization. And my mother, who was very gregarious, very outgoing, would strike up conversations with folks and got to know a few people. And she became very interested in the African dignitaries. And one of the things about the African dignitaries in that period was they wore very striking national dress. They would wear extremely colorful national costumes. I mean, they were breaking out of suits and ties, Western clothing, and trying to get more in touch with validating their historical and cultural traditions as they were re-identifying themselves as independent folk. So she and my father, who was also very interested in Africa from a kind of different perspective, because he had read a lot of the works of an Afro-Antillean, an Afro-West Indian, self-taught historian and journalist by the name of Joel Augustus Rogers, J.A. Rogers. And J.A. Rogers was part of a movement that really goes back to the last quarter of the 19th century, which was involved in something called vindication. Vindication, V-I-N-D-I-C-A-T-I-O-N. Vindicate means to defend, okay? So there were a lot of people all over what we can call the black world. Different parts of the New World, different parts of the Old World where black people settled or were brought, who had been developing a consciousness, especially in the 19th century, throughout the 19th century, but really peaking in the last quarter of the 19th century, where they got really tired of the racist calumnies, the racist, hateful things that were being said about Africans and people of African descent, analogizing them with beasts and saying they were not really a part of the human family, that they were not capable of intellection, you know, that they were outlandish and unassimilable. All of this cant. They got really tired of it. And what they began to do, individually and then collectively, was to research the histories of Africa and its descendants in different places, and to focus on the achievements of African states, African empires, people who were path breakers in science and other fields. So Joel Augustus Rogers, was one of these folks. He made it his life's mission to correct the lies about black inferiority. And he did this by writing columns in black newspapers. And eventually, he started collecting this information that he had been researching and started publishing books. And he self-published these books. This is, of course, before computers, right? He self-published the books because there wasn't a lot of interest in the publishing establishment for the kind of work that he was doing. So he published books with, titles like Sex and Race, From Superman to Man. From Superman to Man is really, really interesting. The reason I'm mentioning this is because my father shared these books with me when I was a kid. Okay? From Superman to Man is a story of a conversation that takes place between a college-educated Pullman porter who is black and a white Southern legislator who is a segregationist. And it takes place over a night as the train is moving. Now this is a conceit. Okay, this is a situation that he creates in order to share his knowledge through the mouth of this porter. And so my father gave me a copy of this, and I was reading it, and it was talking about he would talk about the empires, the African empires of the Western Sudan, Ghana, Mali, and Songhai. And he would talk about enslavement and then various kinds of kings and queens of antiquity in Egypt and other places. I mean, it was really interesting for a kid who was subjected to a lot of racist images in cartoons and in films. I don't know if any of you have ever seen any, but there were a lot of Tarzan films. There were films that really made fun of Africans and people of African descent. They made fun of them by making them look like buffoons, but they also made fun of their languages, where instead of having actors actually speak in indigenous languages, they would have them say things like boogum boogum. Okay, I mean you can see this. This is quite available. This was very common until really the 1960s. Okay? So the entire history of film, the whole century in which film emerges, from silent film to sound film, when it comes to Africans and people of African descent, they are almost invariably subjects of ridicule. Okay? So now I have this book that's like really challenging all of that, and it's providing a corrective. The other thing that my parents did was, because they were very interested in the so-called new African nations. Those nations were not new. They were old nations, but they were new as independent post-colonial nations, like Ghana, in West Africa, like Tanganyika, and then later Tanzania in East Africa. These nations were becoming independent. So in 1959, my parents went to see a traveling musical theater group that was called Le Ballet Africain from the Republic of Guinea. I didn't go with them, but they brought back this book, which is a really colorful program, because this is part of a world tour. And they brought back a record. And this, I had never heard anything like this. I had never heard anything like this music. I'd never seen, this presentation. It happened at a really critical time in history, of which I was not aware then, because I was just a kid. And that was that Guinea, with its capital in Conakry, which was led by a man by the name of Ahmed Sékou Touré, who had been a former trade union leader, who was going to be, was elected the first head of state. France, and this is a very, very long story, and I don't want it to seem too convoluted, but the story that my parents were witnessing was really the beginning of the end of colonialism, the beginning of the end of Africa and other parts of the world, Asia, Latin America, being under the control of people from Europe. It was a long process. The process developed over several centuries, but it was becoming dismantled after World War II. And so France had a very large proportion of people of African descent. France had about half of Africa, and it had about half of the Caribbean, and other places as well. So France also controlled Indochina, okay? And by Indochina, we're talking about modern Vietnam, we're talking about Cambodia, and this is something that started in the 1830s. They also controlled Northwest Africa, the Maghreb, Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco, all in the 1830s. So 100 years, 150 years, well, let's say 120 years later, people in those places are pushing for reforms, okay? And some of them are pushing for disengagement from France. That leads to the war of the Vietnamese for independence against France, which starts after World War II and then peaks in 1954 when the Vietnamese defeat the French at a place called Dien Bien Phu. That rattled the French Empire all over the world. So all of those places that were still part of the French Empire were really aware of this struggle, okay? And then came the struggle of Algeria, okay? Right, on the heels of the Vietnamese victory. So the French colonies were beginning to weaken. They were not about to fall, but they were beginning to weaken as a result of these major disengagements that came from anti-colonial wars, revolutionary wars. Guinea was part of a movement of West African states, including Ivory Coast, Cote d'Ivoire, and Mali, where they were trying to create a kind of union that would improve the circumstances of their people in those three states, Guinea, Mali, and Ivory Coast. So what the head of state of France, who had been a war hero during World War II, Charles de Gaulle, de Gaulle said, okay, how about we have a referendum? Okay, this is 1958. Now, in this referendum, you open up to your people a plebiscite. Does everybody know what a plebiscite is? Okay, it's basically an opportunity for people to vote on a measure. We have a lot of ballot measures that are going to be coming up in the next election, right? But this one was about the status of these states relative to the French community, which is what they were calling it now, but that's the old French colonial setup. And among themselves, Mali and Côte d'Ivoire, Ivory Coast, and Guinea agreed that they were going to vote no to continuing their colonial relationship with France. So that was what they had planned. But the French started to try to make separate deals. They knew that Guinea was going to take a really hard line on this, and they tried to make these separate deals with Côte d'Ivoire, with Ivory Coast, and with Mali. And they went to the head of Côte d'Ivoire, a man by the name of Houphouët-Boigny, and they said, listen, your coastline is really beautiful. We could make this a second Riviera. That could be extremely profitable for you and for your country. But we can't do that if you want to disengage yourself from imperialism. So you want to really think about that. So that became a motivator, and that helped to change his mind. Okay? And to vote we, because the plebiscite was worded in a funny way. The plebiscite was worded in a way that says, do you want to continue your relationship with the French community? And really, what they were saying is, no, we don't want to continue that relationship. We want to be independent. Okay? So if you voted we, if you voted yes, you want to continue your relationship with the French community. Same thing with Mali. They made certain kinds of promises to Mali. They couldn't do it with Guinea because Guinea was really adamant that they wanted to break with this. So when the plebiscite came out, the people voted, the heads of state voted, Houphouët-Boigny of Côte d'Ivoire voted oui, the head of state of Mali, Modibo Keïta, voted oui, and Lone Guinea-Conakry, headed by their head of state said no. Excuse me. And the French reacted really harshly. And the word is they took everything. They took all the records, they took all the light bulbs. The story is they even took the toilet paper. And they said, now you are independent. Okay? So, in the wake of this retaliation, where the French really wanted Guinea to collapse and come crawling back, the head of state said, no, we're not going to do that. So one of the things that he decided to do was to take the culture of Guinea and bank on it. He bankrolled cultural groupings. They started making records, they started traveling, and this is one of the ways that West African music became very, very popular in the late 1950s. And he supported this cultural group called Le Ballet Africain. So my parents saw this, and they shared it with me, and I had that in the back of my mind. Then, when I was in elementary school, my parents continued this. They bought music of Olatunji. I heard that. Olatunji came to my grammar school graduation. Did an assembly, and I went backstage and saw all of these people who were. It was a mix, actually. They were Nigerian, but they were also from other parts of Africa, and they were from other parts of the black world. They were African Americans and Afro-Caribbeans, and I was just really moved by that, even as a young person. So I have all this other stuff going on in my head. I don't just have Tarzan. I don't just have all this racist imagery. I have counter-information. So, by the time I got to college, I was really interested in learning something about Africa. I went to New York University. I found a person who was teaching classes on African history, a man by the name of Dick Hall, Richard W. Hall. I took all of his classes, and I even took an independent study on African literature with him. And then I decided that I wanted to go to graduate school to study African studies. There were only a couple of places where we could do that. One was UCLA. One was Wisconsin. And Wisconsin and UCLA were the oldest within this country. They had a certain rivalry, East Coast, West Coast. There was a thing going on. But two of my teachers were actually Wisconsin people. So they wrote letters, I got in, I went to Wisconsin. And in Wisconsin, my life changed. I became aware of a deep knowledge of Africa. It was so deep that in my first semester as a graduate student, I had to change my prescription. I was doing so much reading. I had to have new glasses, and that was kind of symbolic. It was emblematic because I was seeing, for a new way. So through that, I ended up going to Tanzania, and I wrote on cultural history of Tanzania. But before that, for my master's, I had been working with an incredible teacher by the name of Tom Schick. And he introduced me to a course on Pan-Africanism, and he hired me as his project assistant. And my job was to record all of these presentations by an extraordinary group of people. Bobby Hill, who ended up doing the Marcus Garvey papers, and a whole bunch of folks. I mean, it was just amazing. And I helped him transcribe that, and, it was wonderful, okay? Within that context, I found out about this person by the name of Max Yergan. And so I looked around and said, there's no book on this guy. Maybe I should just do a little work on him. That turned into a master's. And then, after a very long time into this book, so there are a lot of other parts of this, but I just wanted to say, it was in response to the assertion of Africans and people of African descent that I became interested in African history, African culture, African languages, African cinema, okay? And this was in the late 1960s and early 1970s. So, yeah, boomer, I'm one of those. I'm a kind of relic in that sense, but I'm also a survivor of a whole lot of other things, because what we were seeing in those moments was the transformation of consciousness which was leading to a transformation of reality. It was very, very difficult. It was very dangerous. It was very painful. A lot of people lost their lives. Okay, people were incarcerated, people were executed, assassinated, all kinds of things. But we were also seeing a certain kind of assertion which was new. Now, I'm saying it was new in the sense that it was new for our generation. As we began to research, we began to realize that assertion was not new. If we looked at a previous generation or previous generations, we could see in the 1920s, college students were doing incredible things. Workers were doing incredible things. 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, and then we go back, which I did as a historian. I get involved in a lot of these other things. And because my interest was in trying to understand this relationship between people of African descent and Africa, I got really involved in the national histories of a lot of different places. So I got involved in the national history of Ghana. I got involved in the national history of Tanzania. I got involved in the national history of Algeria. I got involved in the national history of Kenya. What led to Mau Mau. I got involved in the national histories of both Saharan and Sub-Saharan Africa. I got involved in the national history of South Africa. Okay? And Max Yergan was a kind of bridge to that, because in becoming involved in the YMCA and being assigned to South Africa, he was able to make changes within the context of an extremely conservative and racist organization. But he was also radicalized by the conservatism and racism. So he leaves South Africa in 1936, and for 12 years, he is a person of the left. He is extremely highly visible in the international left. Okay, he becomes close to Paul Robeson, as Professor Foucault said, and they found this group, the International Committee on African Affairs, in 1937. It becomes the Council on African Affairs in 1941. 1941, he's also the second president of the National Negro Congress, following A. Philip Randolph. Now, the circumstances of the post-World War II situation find him and a number of other people trying to distance themselves from the left, because the winds are changing, okay? And the United States is contemplating the possibility of a confrontation with the Soviet Union. And that leads to the Cold War, and the Cold War has all kinds of ramifications on both sides, all right? So Yergan was one of those people who decided that he did not want to continue struggling for people's rights. He was much more concerned about his own circumstances, especially when he began to realize that he was being surveilled by the FBI and all kinds of other organizations. One of the things that I discovered, I thought Yergan was just a person, but every single intelligence agency in this country had a file on him. Now, I'm not going to defend all of the things that he does after that, but just imagine that. Imagine you coming to realize that, and this is again, long before computers in the way that we understand computers. There were computers. The military had computers, but they were like, there's this big UNIVAC. It was as big as this room, okay? And it ran reels, stuff like that. And that was how they collected data. And I have a slight relationship to that because one of my early jobs in, when I was in high school was I was a clerk at the Brooklyn Navy Yard in data processing. And I was carrying messages. I didn't know how to do the computers. I didn't do anything in data processing. I was a gopher. But the Brooklyn Navy Yard, I found out later, was one of the places that was organizing the data that would be used in Vietnam to call in, bombing and all kinds of other stuff. And when I found out about that later on, I was like, what did I do? That was UNIVAC. That was the huge. I can't even explain how big that computer was, but that was what it was doing. It was one of the things that it was doing. So becoming radicalized myself, I became very curious about the odyssey of Yergan and people like him. And not only the people who stayed the course, but the people who decided that they couldn't. What were the circumstances that caused this person to basically turn his back on his entire community? Because his entire community, all of his friendships, all of his relationships were on the left. And to walk away from that and move into the right. And so that's part of it's a part of the last third of this. Now, what does that have to do with the Black Panthers? Within the context of the Black movement, and some people talk about it as the Black Power movement, but the Black Liberation movement, the Black Freedom movement, which has long legs, okay? It doesn't start in the 1960s. It doesn't start in the 1970s. It doesn't start in the 1950s. It's actually something that is unfolding over the entire course of the 20th century. And some people can say it's even longer than that. Some people can say it began when the first slave rebellions, occurred. And there were hundreds of slave rebellions all over the area of enslavement, which means the Caribbean, which means North America, but it also means places where the enslaved were taken. Portugal, Spain, England, France, Germany. Now, maybe not high in your consciousness because you're not necessarily thinking of large numbers, but Lisbon, the capital of Portugal, Lisboa, in the 17th century, in about 1600, had 100,000 Africans. Okay? And they were doing all kinds of different things. Right? And if you look at other places, you will see this. Now, very, very often it's a very small number of people. Okay? But it's important to have this consciousness that what we talk about within the context of the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, 80s, 90s, it's a much longer story. So what I became involved with was to look at different ways in which people were trying to disengage from imperialism, whether that was overseas imperialism or whether it was a domestic variant of imperialism, which is what the Panthers identify. Okay? And the fact that people were involved in trying to tell their own story, trying to control their own communities, trying to learn languages, trying to teach languages, doing acupuncture, doing all kinds of other stuff, essentially because of the neglect of the larger society and the government. Okay? People who learned how to become barefoot doctors, following the Chinese example, because they didn't have any medical support in their communities. People who learned acupuncture, you know, and learned acupuncture to try to deal with breaking the dependence on substances. You know, I mean, just amazing things that were happening. So, I want to stop here because I want to open up for any kinds of responses that people have.
Well, thank you very much for the wonderful talk.
Thank you.
And I wish we have more time to for you to speak. Unfortunately, the class is only an hour and 5 minutes.
Yeah.
So again, truly appreciate your tremendous insights. And also going back to your childhood, also influence with your mother. And this is tremendous, as well as your interest in West Africa, like Guinea-Conakry, and the regions and culture, La Ballet Africaine, and tremendous cultural influence had upon you, and then nurtures you in many ways your interest in Africa as well as African descendants and diaspora. So I appreciate it. Okay, let's open up the floor for discussion or any questions. Anyone have any question?
Yes.
I was curious about what characteristics of the music of La Ballet Africaine that really struck you and
Well,
how it was different.
That's a really good question. The first thing that really grabbed me was there was an instrument. It's called the kora. It's made from a gourd. It has 24 strings. It's sometimes referred to as a harp lute. It's kind of like a harp. I'd never encountered that before. And later on I found out that it's a very frequently encountered instrument in the old Western Sudan, meaning Mali, and the successor states, Senegambia, Senegal, Gambia, Ivory Coast, and it was an instrument used in the court by bards, by griots, the people who sang the tales of the great leaders, like Sunjata, who founded Mali, and so on. And so I heard that, and there was a person who was singing, and he was a male soprano. So he sang higher than I had ever heard a man sing. And his name was Kouyaté Kandia, or Kandia Kouyaté. Very, very, very famous singer. And when I heard his voice, you know, and then the interplay between his voice and these singers, because it was a call and response, you know, and when it opened up, Nina, na, Nina, ah, Nina, oh, ah, Nina, Nina, Carabona, and then the singers would come back, Nina, na, Nina, and it was like, I was just entranced. It was just amazing, you know. And from that point on, you couldn't tell me any garbage about Africa. I just, you know, I was done with that nonsense. It really started to change me, you know. And then Olatunji kind of took it from another level, because I just saw the power of this music and how much could be done with it, and I realized how central it was to many of these political movements. Because when they had rallies, they would have singers and dancers, and the old courts that existed before colonialism, when the new states were created, they took on the trappings of those old courts. So Sekou Touré would have his griot, he would have his jali, he would have his bard, and having seen and heard that, it just planted some seeds, and I was finished. That's a really good question. Thank you for that. Thank you. Any other questions? I'm sorry I went so long, and I hope that didn't take us too far afield. But I just wanted you to know how this has impacted me and how it's really helped me try to move other people in a particular direction.
Okay. I have a question about the reparation.
Okay.
The state of California under Gavin Newsom recently had decided to create a study group to study the possible reparation for the descendants of African slaves. And it's sponsored by the government of the state of California. And so they gave some suggestions, preliminary reports. And terms of reparation, mostly responsible through the California government playing a central role and paying reparation, restitution, and so on. Now my question has to do with the reparation by the countries like France, you mentioned, or England, or which then turned into Britain. And as you mentioned beautifully about the probably northern half of Africa has been controlled by France. And you talked about Guinea, Cote d'Ivoire, and Gold Coast, also Mali, Algeria. Those are Spanish, part of the Spanish Empire. And so what do you say about the discussions that not only needs to involve the state of California as the center of this facilitating discussions, but also the reparation, the kinds of responsibility of the French Empire, for instance, in paying reparation not only to the descendants of African slaves in the state of California or in the US, but the African slaves they had engaged in the process of accumulating tremendous wealth on the blood and the sacrifices.
That's a really good and really difficult question. It's good because it really makes us understand that this is not a local question. It's not a state question. It's not a national question. It's a global question. Because this is a global system. And it was a global system that was legal. And there's so many ironies that go along with this. The first has to do with the question of accepting responsibility. Okay? Accepting responsibility for the trade is something that still has not been done. Now, you have individuals, you could have a member of the royal family who apologizes, and that's very interesting. But he's not really speaking even for the royal family, which was deeply invested from the time of Queen Elizabeth in, the slave trade. The African, the Royal African Company, Queen Elizabeth was a stockholder. Queen Elizabeth was the first. Okay? So we're talking back in the 1660s. The second thing, responsibility is the first thing. The second thing is some very bizarre things have happened in terms of reparations. So, Haiti when it disengaged from France through its anti-colonial war, ended up owing France and having to pay, and they still are paying France reparations. So, you know, this is kind of perverse, you know, where the former colony is paying, and in fact, that has happened. That has happened for many of these former colonies. They're still paying for the end of colonialism. And these are places that already have tremendous problems financially in paying their debt to the World Bank, you know, for example. So it's a can of worms. I mean, it's a really, really interesting idea. I don't think I'm going to live to see any part of that because because it would require so much for any one of these states to accept responsibility. Now, it has happened to limited extents. I mean, if you look at certain Caribbean states have pushed really hard for the apology. The apology is one step. But the apology actually comes out of a whole process where people have been studying this for a really, really long time, and they've had commemorations. You know. Anyway, that's a great. It's a great question, but I think we need another class to deal with that one.
Any other questions? Earlier this week, we went through this Auckland Community Learning Center and the classes that the supported by Black Panther Party. And it talks about the Ghana Empire, Mali Empire, the Song Empire. And we also watched some of the Timbuktu, the city of knowledge, and how much that the people in those regions are trying to preserve the writings from being destroyed by French colonial powers. And now it's the process being digitized. We also went through the not only West Africa, but East Africa, Egypt, Nubia, Abyssinia, that's Ethiopia. We also talked about the 1959, the agreement between England and the Moroccan Empire to get together to destroy the Song Empire, deconstruct it, and create the diversion within the Song Empire so that slavery would be much more easily facilitated through creating conflicts between different ethnic groups, rather than Song Empire try to control, maintains inclusivity. And so again, that goes back to the French Empire, those Guinea, Conakry, and also Liberia being created as the repository of the free blacks from North America. So those are part of the kind of Black Panther educational programs that started 50 years ago. So we talked about it's already a critical race theory.
Well, it's true, and it's within that particular moment that I was being radicalized. You know, and I'm not going to say that the Panthers alone are responsible for it, but it was an entire nexus of consciousness raising activities, which the Panthers they played a central role, but there were other organizations and there were other currents, so that the students were really pushing. You know, they were pushing for Black studies, they were pushing for other things, and that kind of cross-fertilization of ideas was happening. So one of the things that's important about not having critical race theory framed by its adversaries is to understand that its purpose was to get people thinking and asking questions about how things came to be as they are, and not simply accepting a particular interpretation, which is an interpretation that reinforces the position of the status quo and the people who are leading and benefiting from the labor and often the unpaid labor of others, and have been for a very long time. So it's a concern to change things root and branch that starts with knowledge.
As the former provost of Oaks College, founded by J. Herman Blake, who worked with Huey P. Newton when he was a student. And do you see this legacy of what the J. Herman Blake left, founded this college on the basis of racial justice, equality? Do you think that tradition continues or should continue into the future?
I'm not directly involved with Oaks anymore. I can only talk indirectly about the people that I have met with who are still involved with Oaks. But my impression is that those seeds that were planted during that time are still being watered.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Okay, great. Again, we only have a little more than an hour, and we wish we have more time to have Q&A session. And, thank you very much for coming.
Well, I hope this encourages you to look more and to question more. Don't take anything that anybody tells you, including me, for granted. Question, study.
Thank you.
Thank you.
David.
Thank you.
Now we can stop that. Thank you, David.
Thank you.